I'm Corina, and this is Chicana today. Today we're going to focus on an important piece of Mexican-American history, the Sleepy Lagoon trial. Just what happened and why is no one talking? First, let's go to Karen, who's going to give us a little bit of background information.
Like Corina said, I will be giving you some background on the wartime in Los Angeles.
During 1942, mood was eerie. While the country was at war, the talk was about spies and traitors. Suspicions swirled around young Mexican Americans. The city was not accustomed to diversity. U.S. Navy sailors had no choice but to cut through Mexican American neighborhoods. Even though less than 100 years before Los Angeles belonged to Mexico, Mexican Americans became to be seen as foreigners, although it was a city established by their ancestors. Due to war, there was labor shortage. As military forces called for recruits, Mexican Americans responded in great number and went on to serve with distinction, while Mexican immigrants managed to gain entry to jobs and industries that had been virtually closed to them in the past. These new opportunities liberated many Chicanos from dependence on such traditional occupations such as agriculture. Along with opportunities, tensions were also developed during this time. Due to Great Migration, barrio communities were formed, where splitting of culture was a norm, as growing Chicanos spoke to each other in English and didn't speak much Spanish. They were part of the jazz culture and were forced into segregation. Parents felt their kids were disappearing from them as they were developing their own identity and were later known as pachucos.
Now for the trial itself. In the summer of 1942, a man named Jose Diaz was murdered at a place called the Sleepy Lagoon. It's a kind of cold case piece because no one really knows what happened. A fight broke out at a party and a man was murdered, and during this time of Mexican-American rebellion, someone had to pay.
The Sleepy Lagoon was a reservoir located next to the Los Angeles River. For many young people, it was a swimming hole by day and a lover's lane by night. Mexican-American youth mostly occupied it because they were often denied access to city-owned recreation facilities during this time. On the night of August 1st, 1942, young couples from Los Angeles' 38th Street neighborhood occupied the Sleepy Lagoon. A respected couple by the names of Hank Levas and Dora Barrios were attacked by a rival neighborhood that night. 30 young people piled into cars and headed for the Sleepy Lagoon to seek revenge. Convinced that the boys who assaulted him were there, Hank and the others converged to the party at the Williams Ranch, which was located right next to the Sleepy Lagoon. The outcome of this was a 10-minute fight.
Riots. No one felt safe anymore, and no one trusted each other. During this roundup of innocents, 10 women were investigated. This brought the spotlight to these dangerous women participating in gang activity. Now, not only were the men portrayed as a danger to society, but the women too. Today we have a special guest, a granddaughter of one of the women, Lorena Encinas, that was accused of guilt in this case. She's going to give us the story that her grandmother shared only with her and her family.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Your grandmother's story is very important. A lot of people talk about the Sleepy Lagoon incident, but what a lot of people don't know is that, women were also involved in the incident and that their treatment was very different than that of the young men.
Right.
For example, the women, when they were put into custody, they were put into solitary confinement, while the men were kept together while they were going through this whole trial. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
As a child, do you remember your grandmother talking about the Sleepy Lagoon incident? Or did she describe her life at all in the 1940s?
Well, the Sleepy Lagoon trial, she never discussed, nor the murder itself. She was pretty open about her life before that happened. Like, she would talk about her social life, her friends, how popular she was, going to parties, but never about what happened. And pretty much after her father passed away, everything took a turn for the worse. Her younger brother, my Tío Louis, he pretty much rebelled and got himself into a lot of trouble.
How did she describe the Sleepy Lagoon incident when she finally did decide to talk about it? And also, can you tell us more about her participation in the incident itself?
Well, my grandmother had told my father and his sister right before her passing about what happened exactly. and it was the summer of 42 when it took place. And my grandmother was actually attending a party, and her younger brother had crashed that same party with his friends. And after an altercation, they were forced to leave, and they ran into a boy who was at that party, and they ended up jumping him. And after police arrived, my grandmother was questioned, and she didn't tell him a word. And since she didn't tell him anything, she was taken into custody.
So what happened to your grandmother after she was taken into custody? As we know, there was other women there. So what was that like?
Well, while the trial was taking place that October, actually, it was, and my grandmother was serving time at a jail, which other women as well as that were in there, they were all immediately accused of being accomplices, not only by the police, but by the media. So that's...
Because your grandmother was actually there when the incident took place, did she provide any information to law enforcement? I'm sure they knew that, your Tío Louis was there, so did she talk about that with them?
My father told me that my grandmother was actually very stubborn, and she showed that when it came time to testify. And she did have more information than the other women did that were testifying. And my grandmother, as strong as she was, stood her ground and didn't say a word about what happened. And as hard as the prosecutors had pushed her to give out the smallest information, she never budged.
So what were some of the consequences of choosing to protect her family? Instead of providing that information, she chose to not say anything. What were some of the consequences of that?
Well, of course, her silence resulted in punishment, and she was sent to give up a year of her life and was placed at I believe it was called the Ventura School for Girls, which was a reform school, and it had the worst reputation possible. Girls would actually, to stop themselves from going there, they would do life-threatening things to themselves the night before they were going in. But my grandmother chose to go rather than give up her brother, and she definitely did have to give up a lot. She actually missed the first year of her firstborn, which was my father, Ted, and she didn't know what she was going to lose when she kept her silence, so she knew right from the beginning. And she still remained close to her brother Louis up until his passing.
So there was a lot of attention around the Sleepy Lagoon trial and the incident from news reporters, newspaper. During that time, there was a lot of talk. Did she talk to any of the media about the incident at all?
My grandmother Lorena was the only one who ever spoke about this. None of the other girls did. And when she did speak about it, she didn't speak about it to reporters. The first time anyone said anything was when she said it to us. That was the only time. She didn't say it to anybody else but her family. And her speaking to us about what happened was the only silence that was ever broken when it came down to that event.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with all of our audience and everybody. Thank you again for being here.
Of course,
We're
thank
really
you. I love your necklace.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you to our special guest for joining us today.
Join us next week as we look further into the truth of the Ventura County Reform School for Girls.
This has been a Chicana Today special report. Chicana Today has been brought to you by Diet Pepsi. Nothing refreshes like a Diet Pepsi. Even though Dr. Pepper is better. Is that all? Is that all I have to say? This is a really ghetto commercial, by the way. She's not even talking. This is awkward. Am I still recording?